Well, welcome back to Classic Working Vehicles. On my left, we have a Unimog 421. On my right, we have a Unimog 421. However, they're not both really the same model. They have the same type designation, the 421 part, but actually Mercedes classed them as two different models. This one's actually a U45, this one's a U52. And what do those numbers mean? Well, those numbers were an approximation of the horsepower of the engine of each vehicle. There's actually a U40 as well. The very earliest models of the 421 were called a U40, and again that's because that was the horsepower of the engine, 40 horsepower. So I thought what we might do is have a look at the 421, or at least these two examples, and see what's the same and what's the differences. Partly because I thought it might be interesting to viewers, but also if you're interested in owning or buying a Unimog 421, just seeing the differences between the models so you can make the best choice out of what's available out there for what you might actually want to do with it. Anyway, so let's have a look. So outwardly, these two models look quite similar, and in many ways they are. They share an awful lot of componentry, but this one here dates from 1969, this one's from 1971, and they made this model from mid-60s through till 1989, I think, meaning the model was built for more than 20 years, and inevitably over that time it evolved. So even though it remained as the 421, actually within that type designation there was quite a lot of variation over that time. So if we just look at the two models sat next to each other, you might be able to spot a few differences. Probably the most obvious one is the size of the wheels and tyres. That's not an absolute guarantee of which version of this Unimog it is, but it can be a bit of an indicator. So on the early one here, we've got 18-inch wheels, but they're 9-inch width, and the tyres are 1050s on there. And on the later model, those same wheels were an option, but many of them were fitted with 11-inch wide 18-inch rims with 1250 tyres. So that one of the reasons that they did that was increased flotation, a bit of increased road speed, increased ground clearance, and so on the later models. But of course that does demand a bit more power to be able to pull that vehicle along, because it raises the gearing to some extent. Now often people do want to fit the larger wheels and tyres on the earlier model, and they will certainly fit. However, what you tend to find on these earlier models, particularly the 40 horsepower model, this is the 45, that it will on the road particularly struggle to pull the raised gearing that produces on the vehicle. So actually, in my opinion, these are a better fit for the earlier vehicle. You might also notice that on the earlier vehicle, when you really start to look at it close, if you look at the front wing here, it's actually narrower than the front wing. You can see there's this extra fold in it on the later model with the larger tyres. And actually when you start to look at these models, there's all sorts of subtle differences between them when you really start to explore them. The earlier models also had a shorter load bed, as we can see here. That it shared that load bed and the mounting frame, the X-frame it sits on, with the earlier 411. And I think this was for a couple of reasons. Probably the main one was to reduce the physical load you could actually put into the body on the back of the vehicle, just because of what it was rated to carry, which, it's rated to carry less weight than the larger later model. So when we get to the kind of 1970s period of the 421s, you get a full length body. The shorter body was still an option, but most were fitted with this longer load bed, which obviously allows you to carry more. The wheelbase is identical between the two. It's just how the use of the space on the chassis is made use of on this one. I've got a spare tyre in there, but you could fit a winch in there if you're doing forestry work, all sorts of different options. Another difference, probably hard to see this, but actually the track of the earlier model is narrower than the later model. There's only, I think it's only about 40 millimeters. It's not very much, a couple of inches difference in the track. That looks greater on the later model if fitted with the larger tyres, because the offset is greater as well, making the whole vehicle stance look a bit wider, which people do like that look. But as I say, putting those larger tyres on the smaller engine models just makes them struggle a bit. In terms of speed, I'm not sure speed is particularly important on a Unimog of this era. They are really tractors, but nevertheless, people do want to use them on the road, me included, and so it does make a bit of a difference if you're doing road journeys. So top speed for this one, in terms of its specification, I think was 43 miles an hour. It will certainly do 40 miles an hour. It's comfortable at 35, really, on the flat, cruising along in top gear. Top speed for the earlier model, I think for this one, somewhere in the mid 30s. So it's going to be happy at about 30 miles an hour. So there's one difference if you were looking to buy one of these models. How do you know the difference between these models, apart from these little clues that we're looking at now? Well, they do have a different model designation, or different type designation, I should say. So the type designation can be broken down even further if you want to get really geeky about it, but actually it reveals quite a lot about the specification for the vehicle. So this earlier one is a 421 full stop, or decimal point, 122. And that tells us, the 122 tells us it's the early version of the model, and it's also an open cab, as Mercedes call it, or a soft top. This model, however, is a 421.124, which means it's the open cab model, soft top, of the later version of the Unimog 421. Are you keeping up? So one of the things that is potentially really confusing, actually, with the Unimogs is all the model designations, because there's a type designation, 421, 406, 417, so on. And then there was the model designation, so things like U45, U52, there was a U60, which was this model with a larger engine again, long wheelbase model, quite a rare model. So all those codes are potentially confusing. So I will list them in the description underneath this video. I'll list some of those differences in case you're not keeping up. So maybe let's have a look in the workshop and see what that means in practical terms when we look at the engine and the gearbox. So with a bit of time travel and teleportation, we're able to look at the same Unimog back in the workshop with the cab tilted and see some of the differences between this earlier model and the later one. So if we look down on the chassis, on the right hand side chassis rail, what we might just be able to see, if we're lucky, it might be hard to see, let's have a look. There we are, you can probably just see it says 421 122, and then after that it would have the rest of the chassis number. But that point 122 after the model designation, or the type designation, tells us this is one of the earlier open cab models, which, if we look at it, absolutely it is the open cab model. Another way of spotting the difference between the early models and the late models of the 421 is the early models have these squared off rear wings fitted to the back that were actually carried over from the 411. The later 421s have a rounded rear wing, as we can see here. So it's a bit hard to film, but a good way of knowing for sure whether you've got an early or a late 421 with the larger engine is this reinforcement plate here that attaches to the centre, the main cross member, is at an angle. I'll climb underneath so we can get a look. You can see that this main cross member is on this angled plate. If we look at the earlier 421, you might just be able to see in here that the frame that holds the cross member on is vertical. So this indicates one of the earlier models of the 421. Again, here's a look underneath this main cross member on an early 421, and there you are, there's that vertical plate that it's attached to. We've also actually got this U40 parked in the yard. This is another customer vehicle. It's still very much a working vehicle, worked on forestry, but it has been modified a bit. So it's the earliest version of the 421, but it's had the larger, later wheels put onto it because it's doing forestry work. So having to clamber over logs and branches and things of that sort. Also got a large rollover frame on the top to protect it, and we can get a clearer view actually on this one of this reinforcement plate for the centre cross member. This one's also got the earlier F-type gearbox. Still with the same model designation, but this is a later, this is 1969 421, and by this stage it was fitted with the OM 615, which is the engine we're looking at here. This produced about 45 horsepower, so the power was going up a bit. And by this stage we do get the larger gearbox, the G-type gearbox. This one is fitted with a 6-speed box. It is also fitted, which is a bit of a rarity, these two lower ratio gears, crawler gears. This machine would have been, I think, used with a road sweeper or something of that sort, so it wanted a very low ground speed. But what it isn't fitted with is here, we've just got a standard bell housing. There's no Cascade box, although it was an option on this model. So this is the other 421 in the workshop, which I'm restoring for a customer. And this one has the later OM 616 engine. And by this stage, we're up to 52 horsepower. And this was the final type of engine that was fitted to this model. There was a 60 horsepower option in the Unimog for a long wheelbase version and the short wheelbase version. I think they're pretty much all exclusively the 52 horsepower engine. This one has the large gearbox, the later gearbox, the same as the one we were just looking in, but it does also have the Cascade box. So how might you choose a 421, and why might you choose a 421 over something like the 406? Well, they are a more compact vehicle, and in some situations that's going to matter. They are quite a bit smaller than the 406, even though they share a cab. The cab is actually quite a bit narrower. On the closed cab models, it's actually the cab is the same, but they are physically smaller in all dimensions. They're narrower, they're shorter wheelbase, they're not as tall, and so on. So that has some advantages. I find from my contracting side of the business, for a lot of the properties I try and get to, I need to get to do jobs, it's a lot of kind of equine horse properties that I work with. Access is quite limited. So a relatively small machine to be able to get into small paddocks and being manoeuvrable has real advantages for me. I'm not doing a lot of hauling with the vehicle. I'm not generally hauling heavy trailers, things of that sort, which certainly the Unimog will do. Even these early models will pull sort of 3 times their own weight, but with the horsepower that they have, they're going to do that pretty slowly. But as a solo vehicle or as an implement carrier, whether it's a hedge cutter or a topper or whatever it may be, they'll nip along quite well. And if you think about it, they're doing, certainly the later model here is doing similar speeds to big modern tractors on the road. So it does mean I can travel reasonable distances, but still have a vehicle that's small and which is useful for access into small gateways or small paddocks and so on. Another advantage if you're just owning one as an enthusiast or as a collector, particularly the U40 and the U45, is that they're pretty much small enough that you could get them in a domestic garage or park them on a domestic drive somewhere. So if you just fancy owning one, but you don't have a barn to keep it in, it's one of the few Unimogs. The 411 I'd put in this category as well, but they're small enough that you can have them parked on your drive, or certainly in some domestic garages, or if you've got the soft top model, if the garage is a bit low, you can fold down the screen. It's all hinged. You can fold down the hood. Very similar to a Land Rover, you can take the door tops off and you can make it a much lower profile vehicle to fit it in a smaller garage. So it means you can own a Unimog without necessarily needing to be farming. I think by the time you get to the 406, it's more like a small truck really, and you just need more room to keep it. So these smaller models have that advantage. If we look at the chassis, all the 421s, all the versions of the 421 have a straight chassis frame. The bigger models, when we go up to the 406, they have a drop down in the chassis frame. It's partly so you can get a spare wheel into there, but all of these have a straight chassis frame, and that chassis frame was actually carried over from the earlier 411. The long wheelbase 411 shares an awful lot of componentry with the 421. Strangely, the same chassis, the long wheelbase chassis in the 411, becomes the short wheelbase chassis in the 421. So, you know, that's one of the ways they made it a bigger vehicle than the earlier model. But again, 406, bigger again. As I say, wheelbase on the later versions of the 421, they're the same. It still has the straight chassis rails. The axles are essentially the same. It has the classic Unimog portal axles, but they are a little bit narrower on the earlier versions of 421 compared to the later model. This one has all the agricultural equipment fitted to it at the moment, like so the 3-point linkage and the drop box, the banana box on the back for the PTO. But all of that can be fitted to this model just the same. Both of these are tippers, not all of them are, but you can see there's a hydraulic ram on a gimbal, so when this has got its boards on the side and things, can be used as a tipper just the same as this one can, but its gross vehicle weight is less. It can carry less load than this one. This one's rated to carry a little bit more. If we look inside the cab in the earlier model, power steering was an option on the earlier model. This one does have power steering. We have what's called the G gearbox in here, but this doesn't have the Cascade box. So this is basically a straightforward 6-speed gearbox. There's your main gear lever. Forward and reverse is separate, which is this lever. This controls your power takeoff, so the rear power takeoff, having no power takeoff, so in neutral, having front power takeoff, or if you move the lever all the way forward, you've got front and rear power takeoff. This lever is, we're in 2-wheel drive at the moment. If you move it to that location, that's 4-wheel drive, and you can do that on the move. And if we move it all the way back there, that's axle diff lock, which is air operated. There we go. So we're back in 2-wheel drive. So it has full, genuine diff lock on a Unimog. All Unimogs do. That's part of what makes them so effective off-road. We've also got an extra lever here, which is not common actually on this gearbox. If you put this gear stick, the forward and reverse, into neutral, we can move that lever forward, and that will give us in first and second 2 lower speeds. This Unimog's actually an ex-German Army Unimog, not as a troop carrier or anything, but as an implement carrier. So I imagine it had something like a sweeper or something on the front, on an army camp or something of that sort, or maybe it might have had snow removal equipment. So this has been fitted to be able to have a lower crawl speed without having the larger and much more expensive Cascade box. So let's have a look in the other model. to see how the Cascade box compares. Let's compare this gearbox setup then in the later 421. This one still has two-wheel drive, four-wheel drive, and diff lock, just like the other model. Got PTO engagement, just like the other model. Handbrake's the same, and we have the same 6-speed gearbox in these two models. However, and we've got forward and reverse in the same way. But what we've also got in here is the Cascade box. So this lever has 3 potential positions. That offers a total of 3 additional ranges for the 6-speed gearbox. So we can have that disengaged entirely, which is the situation it's in at the moment. And we've just got the highest range 6-speed box. If I move that lever forward, that would give us low range. So you have all 6 gears again, but they're in a lower range. If we move this lever forward and across, we get crawler, but it only allows you to use the bottom 4 gears in the main box once you're in crawler. And if we move it forward one more time, we have super crawler, again, bottom 4 speeds. Each of those ranges is only engaged when we move this lever forwards. So you're pre-selecting with this lever, and then when you actually want to bring it into action, whatever range you've chosen, you bring that lever forward. It's much harder to explain than it is to use, in fact. It does take a little bit of getting used to. The other, what I find a great advantage with the Cascade box, particularly on the lower powered Unimogs, so the 421s, is that you can use high and low as a splitter box. So you can be driving along, let's say in top gear, high range, come to a bit of a bank on a road, and fifth might be too low. You might be losing too much speed, or the engine revs being too high. So what you can do is bring this lever forward, leaving it in 6th, and then you're in 6th low. And you can do that on the move while you're driving along, and it's basically splitting the gear. It's like a ratio that's halfway between 5th and 6th in the high range. Let me know in the comments if you want me to do a separate video on just driving with this gearbox on the road, so you can see it in practice and see how it works. So that Cascade box was an option on this earlier Unimog. It just happens that this example isn't fitted with it. If we go to the earlier F box, which is the gearbox which preceded this one, that didn't have the Cascade option. You could have that 2 lower speeds, but you couldn't have the full Cascade gearbox. So if you're interested in owning a 421, which model should you choose? Well, in practice, probably you're going to have to choose the one that's available, because they were a rarity. And chances are also you're going to be choosing one more on condition than specification, depending on how much work you want to get involved in. If you're watching my other YouTube videos, you can see that I'm restoring another U21, same specification as this one, so the larger OM 616 engine, full Cascade gearbox and so on. That probably out of the 421 models is the most desirable one. It's the larger engine with the full gearbox. That means it can do just about all the jobs on the farm you might want it to do. However, the smaller U40 and U45, still the 421 type, but it's got a slightly smaller engine, the OM 615 in the case of the U45. That's a 2.2 litre naturally aspirated diesel, and this one is a 2.4 naturally aspirated diesel engine. One is derived from the other. Still a very usable Unimog. That reduction in power, actually, if you're in the field, for most jobs, doesn't make a huge amount of difference. If you're doing something like grass cutting with it, the smaller engine doesn't really matter. You might miss the Cascade gearbox depending on the sort of work you're doing. When I'm doing hedge cutting, I want very low ground speeds, for instance, and I can get that with a Cascade box. Probably could get that with this one because it happens to have those 2 lower ratios. So probably the things you're going to be considering are condition of the vehicle. You know, do you have the skills or access to equipment and tools and things to be able to restore one? They are, for the time, complicated. You know, if you compare them to tractors of the time, there's a lot more complexity in a Unimog compared to a Massey Ferguson tractor of the era or something of that sort. And they're a tractor that also think they're a small truck. So they're covering kind of 2 areas, and that's of course part of the appeal, but it does add complexity. So I'm aware there's the potential I might have confused you more than helped you, trying to explain all the differences within the 421 model range, because there are a lot. What I will do though, in the description below the video, I'll lay out some information about the different models, different years, engine powers and so on. So to help you get your head around all the different designations that there were over the years. Anyway, I hope that's been interesting. We're losing the light now, so I'm going to have to stop talking. But I hope that was useful and interesting. If you've got questions or comments, put them below. If there's something you want to see in a later video to help explain some of these differences further, like the gearbox or the engine, whatever it may be, let me know below and I'll see if that's something I can cover in a future video. Anyway, thanks for watching. See you next time. A 421 123. There's also a 421 121.